The Supreme Court is out with a new ruling today. Texas and Louisiana do not have authority to challenge the Biden administration's guidelines for when to deport migrants from the country, handing a win to President Biden on immigration policy.
In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court determined the two states lacked the standing to sue over one of the Department of Homeland Security's latest directives. Texas and Louisiana's lawsuit alleged that the federal government did not have the authority to make such determinations to who is deported.
Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote for the majority, the states essentially want the federal judiciary to order the executive branch to alter its arrest policy so as to make more arrests.
On the policy, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas said back in 2021, quote, "We will focus our efforts on the greatest threats while also recognizing that the majority of undocumented non-citizens who have been here for many years and who have contributed positively to our country's well-being are not priorities for removal." So Justice Kavanaugh wrote the opinion here, and to see this court rule 8-1 is something that I really didn't see coming out of this session from the Supreme Court. But it seems to me that they see this really as a matter of federal versus state power and have ruled in the favor of federal power, which isn't always how they see issues. And this is possibly a ruling that's just specific to this case, but we've seen a lot of discussion around what is and is not constitutional in the favor of states' rights, and us revisiting a conversation around federalism and how much power the federal government should have. But it seems to me that they do want to keep decisions when it comes to immigration policy in the hands of the federal government rather than giving more of that jurisdiction to the states for them to make determinations on who should be arrested and how many people should be arrested when it comes to detaining migrants.
Yeah, that was kind of the fundamental snare that the states suing ran into here. Immigration law is not like environmental law. In a lot of environmental law, you are allowed as a state or as a person to sue based on perceived harm. Basically, there's a clear delineation of who is allowed to go after the federal government for policies and the perceived harm that they cause them, whereas immigration law is not so clear cut. There isn't currently legislation that really lays out the path for a state to be able to sue on alleged lack of enforcement of immigration policy. But it is important to remind that the Supreme Court did not rule on the merits of the law itself or the merits of Biden's directives. And they kind of left it open, saying that, you know, if somebody who does have the standing to sue, if somebody who can make the case that they have received harm from this were to move forward with a separate lawsuit, that perhaps they would consider the idea that Biden is not properly upholding immigration law.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting that they decided to take the case, which they have a lot of discretion over what cases they take. I mean, they get hundreds of cases that they can pick from annually. And it takes a few justices to take an interest in a case for it to be investigated and for them to receive the amicus curiae briefs. And then from there, decide what cases, you know, they're going to hear arguments for before the Supreme Court. So the fact that they chose this case to make clear that states can't sue on this grounds is really interesting to me, what kind of precedent they were interested in setting there, because there is some kind of calculation that goes into what cases they hear and what cases they don't hear. And I strongly believe that they choose cases for reasons of they believe it's relevant and timely and something that the court needs to make a decision on based on the state of our nation, which of course is a political determination. So this idea that the court is not political is not something I really believe in, because just their determination of which cases to hear has to be by nature some kind of political decision on their behalf. Whether they do it to help one party or another, or one ideological faction or another, is a different conversation. But it is political in nature to pick priorities in this way and kind of say to the states, you can't sue over something like this. But what they've done in many of their opinions before is say, but bring us the case on this other relevant thing. They've done this when it comes to abortion. They've hinted, Clarence Thomas, when it comes to wanting to hear cases about same-sex marriage, to hear cases about interracial marriage, for them to signal in their briefs and in their opinions and their write-ups what cases they would like to hear is something that is a big red flag for me, for the Supreme Court to say, please sue on this grounds so we can make a ruling and affirm that this is constitutional in one way or another. That's a very interesting political position for the Supreme Court justices to take.
I want to provide a little more context, too, about the law that this is in regards to, because immigration law apparently requires the executive and the Department of Homeland Security to prioritize deportation and removal of certain criminal illegal aliens, meaning people who have crossed the border illegally and have a criminal record or have committed a crime in the United States. And what the Biden administration did is they basically narrowed that authority to a smaller subset of criminal illegal aliens, claiming that they don't have the ability to get rid of everybody under an expedited process, which I guess doesn't totally not make sense considering just how many people are crossing the border right now. A lot of people have characterized this as a crisis, although the Biden administration has shied away from that term. There's been something like 200,000 illegal crossings every single month since Biden took office. But if federal law does require you to prioritize certain individuals and you decide that you're only going to do, say, half of those, then it stands to reason that you are in violation of federal law. So I do think that there is kind of a signal to conservatives or Republicans here. If you find someone who does have standing to sue, to go after Biden for failing to uphold immigration law as the executive, then perhaps we would be willing to take your side on this.
Yeah, it's very interesting how vague the interpretation of this law could be, or the law is vague, so it can be interpreted in many ways, rather. Just to say that you're prioritizing individuals that are a threat to public safety, it makes it very difficult for folks to determine who that is under the Obama administration. We had a lot of deportations of folks who had a felony conviction. And so there were a lot of people who had lived in the United States, who were refugees from other countries like Cambodia, who came as children. And they don't speak Khmer, they don't understand the culture in Cambodia, and they were deported many years after even committing a crime. And a lot of these folks joined gangs in places like California, where they arrived in the United States, because they didn't fit in with the culture here and they didn't really have a full home here. They came as refugees. And so when you join gangs, typically you get caught up in criminal activity and you might get a felony charge at a very young age and then get deported at age your mid-20s or 30s when Obama's in office. And then you have to be in another country you've never been to before, and we're paying for those flights. It just seems to me that drawing this line when it comes to immigration, it's an impossible thing to implement. And so taking the approach like Texas and Louisiana by saying, we need some wider criteria than this is, I'm not sure there's ever a perfect way to go about doing this. And it seems to me that this is just a call for more specific immigration policy so that it's implementable.
I would like to see legislation on immigration policy, definitely, because there is so much room for the executive to basically manipulate and navigate around certain directives and kind of just do whatever they want. There is a legal distinction, though, between an illegal immigrant and a refugee. A refugee status can't really be revoked, or a refugee can't be deported in the same way that an illegal immigrant can. So a lot of those cases under the Obama administration were people who claimed to be political refugees but did not actually have the legal status under those programs. And I certainly am not going to excuse someone who joins a gang because they don't feel like they fit in. But I understand that there is so many different, ways that various administrations are trying to enforce immigration policy. And it doesn't provide proper continuity for people to understand, am I going to be deported? Am I going to be allowed across the border? And it's part of what's caused the chaos with the current border situation, because there was such a drastic shift in how immigration policy was being enforced from the Trump administration, which was very strict and basically did not allow any illegal immigrants to be released into the United States after crossing the border and being caught by Border Patrol, including asylum seekers. Whereas you get to the Biden administration, there was a deportation moratorium. They ended the Remain in Mexico policy. They blew up the U.S.-Mexico agreement, and basically were relying on Title 42 to help them process these expedited removals. So that did send a signal to a lot of people across the border that the border's open for business, come across and you're not going to get in trouble. So I understand that there needs to be more continuity and there should be a legislative effort, but this has been a disaster for decades at this point, and there doesn't really seem to be an appetite for anyone trying to find some compromise on this issue or even bringing it up for debate. The right talks about it all the time, but I haven't seen them put together a comprehensive immigration package that they would be willing to present in front of the Congress, and I think it's important that they do so.
Yeah, it seems that we'll see migration policy continue to wax and wane according to who we have in the highest office, who the administration is, rather than who is the governor of respective states trying to sue for more power. Very interesting 8-1 ruling out of the Supreme Court today upholding Biden's migration policy. We're going to have to leave this story here, but we've got more rising for you after this.